The rain had been falling since afternoon, a steady, unbroken rhythm that seemed to echo the noise in Ethan's head. By the time he reached the gallery that evening, the streets shimmered under the weight of water and distant neon. Julian stood waiting just inside, his shirt damp at the collar, hair curling slightly from the humidity. He smiled as Ethan entered, and that smile, gentle, certain, unraveled every hesitation Ethan had carried with him. They didn't speak at first. Julian simply handed him a towel, a small gesture that felt oddly intimate. The space was quiet except for the rain against the glass walls. Tonight, the exhibition was closed. Julian had told him he wanted to show one last collection before it moved to another city. Ethan had almost declined. Almost. But something about the idea of being seen again, of being somewhere that wasn't full of silence, had drawn him here like gravity that he followed Julian between canvases that glimmered faintly under low lights. Each piece looked like a confession painted into shape, fractures, light, and shadow dancing across the walls. Julian stopped before one in particular, its surface streaked with silver and ash. "It's about things people don't say," he murmured. "What we hide to survive." Ethan's voice was quiet. "Does it ever work? Hiding?" Julian looked at him. "Only until someone looks closely." Ethan turned away from his gaze, staring at the texture of the paint. He could feel his chest tighten. That sentence had struck too close. The truth was that hiding had become a habit, one he'd perfected beside Michael, where everything personal had turned practical. Michael wasn't cruel, just distant. And Ethan had grown tired of trying to be heard by someone who refused to listen. Julian's voice cut through his thoughts. "You seem tired of pretending." Ethan laughed softly, without humor. "I don't even know who I'm pretending for anymore." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was charged. Julian stepped closer, slow enough for Ethan to move if he wanted. He didn't. The sound of rain filled the distance between them until Julian's voice dropped, almost a whisper. "You said you couldn't take it anymore." Ethan met his eyes. "I did. And yet you came. I told myself it was just for the art." Julian's smile was sad. "You knew it wasn't." Ethan should have stepped back, should have said something to end the moment before it became irreversible. But when Julian brushed a strand of wet hair from his forehead, Ethan felt the tremor of something he'd buried too long. His heart beat against his ribs like it wanted to be heard. He whispered, "Julian, I can't." Julian's response was a breath against his skin. "Then don't say anything." It wasn't the kind of passion born from recklessness. It was quiet, searching, the collision of two people who had been lonely for too long. The rain outside grew louder, as if it were trying to drown out what they were doing. And when it was over, the silence returned, soft, fragile, real. Ethan sat at the edge of the couch, still catching his breath. The faint smell of paint and rain lingered in the air. Julian stood nearby, looking out the window, saying nothing. Ethan felt the weight of what had just happened settle in his chest. Guilt, fear, relief, they all mixed until he couldn't tell them apart. "I warned you," he said quietly. "I said I couldn't take it." Julian turned, his eyes calm. "You didn't take anything. You just stopped giving everything away." Ethan wanted to argue, to call it what it was, but he didn't. Words felt too small for the ache in his chest. He dressed in silence, every movement careful, as though making noise might break the fragile air around them. Before leaving, Julian touched his hand, a fleeting gesture, and said, "Don't hate yourself for wanting to feel alive." Outside, the rain had eased to a drizzle. The walk home felt endless. Ethan's reflection in each window he passed looked like a stranger's, someone braver, and yet far more lost. When he entered the apartment, Michael was asleep on the couch again, the television humming faintly. The soft blue light fell across his face, making him look peaceful, almost innocent. Ethan stood there for a moment, trying to remember the last time he'd touched him, really touched him, without distance between them. He couldn't. That he moved quietly to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. His hands were trembling. The guilt came in slow waves, crashing and retreating before he could breathe. He wanted to cry, but nothing came. He lay down, staring at the ceiling, the rain whispering against the windows. Somewhere in the next room, Michael stirred but didn't wake. Morning came gray and cold. Michael left early, leaving behind the usual note on the counter, meeting till late. Don't wait up. Ethan stared at it, then folded it neatly and placed it in the trash. His phone vibrated once, a message from Julian. You left your scarf. Want me to drop it off? Ethan typed back, no, it's fine. Keep it. Then deleted the message before sending it. He couldn't trust himself anymore. The following week unfolded like a slow punishment. He tried to act normal, but the world felt tilted. Every sound seemed sharper, every silence heavier. At work, he caught himself smiling for no reason, then panicking that someone might notice. When Michael spoke to him, small things, routine things, Ethan's responses came delayed, as if his thoughts were always somewhere else. Julian didn't push. There were no more texts, no calls. But one evening, as Ethan walked home, he saw him across the street, hands in pockets, waiting at a light. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and that was enough. The ache returned, fierce and familiar. Later that night, Ethan stood on the balcony, watching lightning flicker behind the clouds. He told himself it was over, that it had been a mistake, that he would forget. But memory has its own rhythm. He remembered Julian's words, his touch, the way he'd listened without judgment. He remembered how it felt to be seen. Michael came out of the bedroom then, rubbing his eyes. You're still up? Ethan nodded. Just couldn't sleep. Michael leaned against the doorway. You've been quiet lately. Is everything okay? For a heartbeat, Ethan thought this might be the moment, the one where he finally told the truth, where everything could still be mended. But when he looked into Michael's tired face, he saw only confusion, not understanding. He forced a small smile. Yeah. Just work. Michael nodded and went back inside. The door clicked softly shut. Ethan exhaled and pressed his palms against the railing. His breath fogged in the cold air. He whispered into the dark, I can't take it anymore. The next day, as he left for work, his phone buzzed again. A new message appeared on the screen. Julian, I'm sorry if I crossed a line. But I can't pretend that night didn't mean something. Ethan stared at it for a long time before sliding the phone back into his pocket. That evening, he didn't go straight home. He walked the long way through the rain, the city lights glimmering on wet asphalt. Somewhere deep inside, he already knew he was walking toward another mistake, and when he finally reached the corner near the gallery, Julian was standing there, waiting, no words, no explanations. Just a quiet understanding that neither of them could undo what had begun. Ethan stopped, caught between fear and desire, conscience and longing, and though the night was cold, he didn't turn away. The following morning began like any other, but everything felt slightly off, like the world had shifted a few inches to the left while I wasn't looking. I went through the motions, coffee, emails, meetings, polite small talk. But every time Marcus walked past my desk, the air tightened around me. He seemed composed, maybe even more so than usual, but I noticed the small tells, the brief pauses before he spoke, the way his fingers drummed softly against the folder he held. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It was awareness. The same awareness that now lived between us, silent and alive. By afternoon, I had convinced myself it would fade. It had to. We hadn't crossed any visible lines, and people forget fleeting moments when they want to. I was sure Marcus wanted to, but then, as I packed my bag that evening, I heard his voice. Ethan, a minute. He stood by his office door, expression calm but eyes shadowed. I followed him in, closing the door behind me. The soft click sounded louder than it should have. He didn't sit behind his desk this time. Instead, he leaned against it, arms folded. I told Liam you helped me home that night, he said evenly. I thought he should know. My stomach tightened. That's good. You didn't have to, but honesty's always best. He nodded. Yeah. He asked what we talked about. I told him I barely remembered. Something inside me stung at that, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe because I remembered every word. Marcus continued quietly. He said he was glad I had someone to count on at work. Said you must be a good person. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. The silence stretched between us, heavy but not uncomfortable, just real. He sighed. I've been thinking a lot about that night, Ethan. About what I said. I was drunk, but not so drunk I didn't mean some of it. I met his gaze. You don't have to explain. It's not my place to. I do, he interrupted gently. Because it wasn't fair to you. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. You didn't ask for any of that. And I don't want you carrying it like a secret. You've done nothing wrong. His voice was calm, but I could feel the weight behind it, the struggle to keep emotion contained. I wasn't hurt by it, I said quietly. If anything, I understood. His eyes softened. That's exactly what makes it harder. We stood there for a long moment, the low hum of the air conditioner filling the silence. He looked tired again, the same kind of tired I'd seen when he'd sat on his couch, talking about pretending through life. I'm trying to fix things, he said finally. With Liam. We've been distant. I don't want to lose him. The words landed with quiet finality. I nodded, throat tight. You shouldn't. He sounds like a good man. He is, Marcus said softly. And I've been a coward. I wanted to tell him he wasn't, but maybe he was right. We all were, sometimes. Afraid to ruin what we built, even when it stopped feeling like home. Marcus, I said, my voice steady, you don't owe me an apology for what you felt. People can't always control what they feel. Only what they do with it. He looked at me for a long time, expression unreadable. You're wiser than you should be at your age. I smiled faintly. I've had good teachers. A flicker of something, gratitude, sorrow, maybe both, crossed his face. Ethan, I think it'd be best if we kept things simpler between us. Professional. At least for a while. I'd expected it. Still, hearing it made something inside me sink, slow and heavy. That makes sense. He nodded. You're good at your job. I don't want to make it harder for either of us. The conversation ended there, but his tone lingered in my chest long after I left his office. Days passed quietly. He kept his word, professional, polite, distant. I did the same. We spoke only when necessary. But sometimes I'd catch him looking out his office window during late hours, his expression somewhere far away. I never asked what he was thinking. Some silences are better left untouched. A week later, I found a note on my desk. His handwriting, precise, slanted, confident. Thank you for being there when I wasn't myself. You reminded me of something I'd forgotten, that honesty doesn't always destroy, it sometimes saves. Take care of yourself, Ethan. No signature, but it didn't need one. That night, I stayed late at the office. The city lights glimmered outside, reflections rippling across the rain-slicked windows. For a moment, I imagined Marcus walking through the door again, tie loosened, asking if I ever got tired of being the reliable one. But the image dissolved as quickly as it came. Maybe that was the lesson, we're all temporary chapters in someone else's story. Sometimes we leave a mark, sometimes just a page turned too quietly to notice. When I finally shut down my computer and stepped outside, the rain had started again, soft and steady, like the night it all began. I walked without an umbrella, letting the water soak through my shirt. The air smelled of wet asphalt and something bittersweet I couldn't name. That I thought about Marcus and Liam, how they might be talking right now, maybe rebuilding what had cracked. I hoped they were. Despite everything, I wanted him to be happy. Somewhere deep down, I also knew I'd miss him, not the boss, not the man who apologized, but the version of him that existed only in those quiet, suspended moments. The one who had let himself be seen. By the time I reached my apartment, the rain had slowed. I poured a glass of water, stood by the window, and watched the city blur through streaks of moisture. It felt almost poetic, the same rain that had begun this strange, unspoken chapter was now washing it away. Maybe that was what closure really was, not forgetting, but learning to stop rewriting the same night in your head. That I picked up my phone, opened our last email thread, and hovered over his name for a moment. Then I closed it. Some stories don't need an ending, they just fade when they're ready. As I turned off the lights and lay in bed, I could still hear the soft echo of his voice, steady, tired, human. You reminded me of who I used to be. I wondered if he'd ever think of me when it rained again. I knew I would. The days that followed settled into a strange rhythm. I would see Daniel outside most evenings, sitting on the porch with a quiet patience, as if waiting for something that no longer existed. I began to find excuses to walk past his house, to check the mail, to water a plant I barely cared for, to pretend I had a reason to be near him. Each time, he looked a little different, sometimes shaven and calm, sometimes lost in thought, and sometimes holding that same half-empty beer bottle, like a habit he couldn't break. One Thursday evening, he called out to me. "Ethan," he said, leaning over the fence, "you're always out here alone. You ever eat dinner with someone, or is solitude your thing too?" I smiled, caught off guard by the sudden familiarity. "Depends who's asking. Someone who's tired of takeout and silence." That was how it began, dinners that felt harmless, ordinary. The first night, we ordered Chinese food and sat in his living room, the air filled with the faint scent of soy and ginger. The space felt strangely hollow, like a house rearranging itself after being emptied. I noticed that the walls were bare where picture frames had once hung. There was a faint tan line where Clara's photos used to be. He caught me looking. "She took the frames, too," he said, without bitterness. "Didn't even leave the nails." We both laughed, but it was a quiet, tired kind of laughter. Our conversations drifted from small talk into something heavier, like water seeping through a crack. Daniel spoke about his marriage the way some people talk about weather, inevitable, unchangeable. "We stopped talking years before we stopped being married," he said. "I just didn't notice the silence anymore." I listened, unsure what role I played in his healing, a neighbor, a witness, or something he hadn't named yet. I told him about my own failed relationships, about how I'd learned to fill loneliness with work and distraction. He smiled faintly. "Guess we're both specialists in pretending." The more time we spent together, the more I began to recognize the small details of him, the way he rubbed the back of his neck when he was uncertain, the pause he took before admitting anything personal, the low hum he made when he was thinking. There was no clear moment when concern turned into something else, but I started to feel it, a quiet pull I couldn't rationalize. One evening, I found him fixing a loose porch step. He was wearing an old gray t-shirt, the kind softened by years of wear. His forearms were streaked with sawdust. He looked up and grinned. "Want to hand me that screwdriver?" I did, and as our fingers brushed, something unspoken passed between us, fleeting but unmistakable. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then continued working as if nothing had happened. I tried to act natural, but my heart gave itself away. When the step was done, he sat back and sighed. "You ever feel like you're rebuilding something you know will never be the same again?" I nodded. "All the time." He looked at me, eyes catching the fading light. "That's what this house feels like. Every nail I drive in just reminds me of what's missing." That night, the air turned colder. A thin drizzle began, and the smell of wet soil filled the neighborhood. I helped him carry the tools inside. His living room was dim, the light of a single lamp stretching long shadows across the floor. Music played softly from a speaker, something slow and instrumental. "Stay for a bit," he said. "It's miserable out there." We sat on opposite ends of the couch, our conversation wandering. He asked me about my family, my work, my reasons for staying in this town. I answered honestly, though I could feel his attention resting on more than my words. The rain intensified, tapping steadily against the windows. At one point, he leaned back and exhaled. "It's strange," he said. I spent years trying to be what she wanted, strong, reliable, predictable. But in the end, none of that mattered. She said I'd become a stranger. Maybe she just stopped seeing you, I said quietly. He turned to me, eyes searching. Do you? The question hung between us, heavier than it should have been. I could hear the sound of the rain, the slow rhythm of my heartbeat, and the space between his words. I wanted to look away, but I didn't. No, I said finally. I see you. Something shifted in the air then, like the pause before a storm breaks. He didn't speak, but his gaze lingered long enough for meaning to settle. The moment didn't need words, it lived in the silence, in the closeness of two people who had nowhere else to place their loneliness. A flash of lightning briefly illuminated the room. We both flinched, half laughing at our reaction, but the tension remained, quiet, fragile, real. He reached for the remote to turn the music down, and his hand brushed my knee. He froze, then pulled back, muttering, "Sorry." "Don't be," I said before I could stop myself. He looked at me again, the apology fading from his face, replaced by something else, a kind of recognition neither of us had wanted to admit. The rain outside softened, turning into a steady whisper. We sat there in silence, the distance between us shrinking until it wasn't just physical anymore. I could feel the weight of what wasn't being said pressing into the air around us. I thought about how dangerous it was, not in the obvious sense, but in the quiet, emotional way that leaves marks you can't explain. He was the first to move. Slowly, he stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the dark street. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," he said. "Every time I start to feel alive again, it feels like betrayal." "Maybe it's just healing," I said. "They look the same sometimes." He didn't answer, just nodded faintly, his reflection a shadow against the glass. Then he turned back to me. "You should probably head home. It's late." The dismissal was gentle, not cold. I stood, unsure of what to say, feeling the moment slip between us like smoke. As I reached the door, he spoke again, softly, almost as if to himself, "Thank you for staying." I hesitated. "You don't have to thank me." He smiled, small, tired, and real. "I think I do." Outside, the rain had stopped, but the world still smelled of it, damp earth, clean air, a kind of freshness that felt undeserved. I walked the short distance to my house, feeling both lighter and heavier at once. Later that night, lying in bed, I replayed the evening in my mind, every glance, every silence, every word left hanging. There had been no confession, no touch that crossed a line, yet everything in me knew that something irreversible had begun. Through the thin wall, I could hear faint movement again, footsteps, maybe, or a restless soul pacing in the dark. I wondered if Daniel was awake too, haunted by the same questions. Before I fell asleep, one thought settled in me with quiet certainty: whatever we had become, it wasn't just neighbors anymore. And whatever was coming next, neither of us was ready to name it.